Okay, hello everybody. This is the first episode for the tutorials from our Magic app, and this video is the bare basics. So I'm going to be talking about what the different types of cards are and what they do, because there's multiple different cards that do different things, and if you're trying to learn the game, you gotta go over what each individual type of card does. So I'm gonna go over some of the easiest stuff first. So this right here, this is a non-basic land. So there are two types of lands. There are basic lands and non-basic lands. And basic lands, when they enter the battlefield, you just play them, right? And if you tap them for mana, that's all it does. An island produces blue mana, mountain produces red mana, forest produces green mana, and so on with plains and white mana and swamps with black mana. So basic lands are the core of a lot of decks because you have to have them to be able to play anything. So basic lands, they enter the battlefield, they don't enter in tapped or anything special, and they just tap for 1 mana. Now, on non-basic lands, there are lots of different types of non-basic lands, but the way you can tell what a basic land is if it just says basic land, it'll say basic land, or on some of the older lands, it'll just say land, but it has no words. So these are special full art versions, but this is how lands will look. So they don't have any words. All they have is the artist, the copyright, the name of the land, and what color they produce. So this produces green mana because it's a forest. So non-basic lands look like this, and they generally have text. So this card, it enters the battlefield tapped. So when you play it, it comes in tapped. And tapped is like what happens to different creatures or lands or artifacts or anything when you use their abilities. So this one says tap to add 1 black, 1 green, or 1 blue mana to your mana pool. So instead of having a black mana, a green mana, or a blue mana, instead you can just have this one instead of having to have a swamp, a forest, and an island on the field. You can just have this one and choose which one you want. So basic lands are great for when you're playing decks with multiple colors in it, because that way you can play all the different cards that you need without having to have the struggles of not having the right color mana on the field. Okay, so now we're gonna go to different creatures. So, creatures are they're the creatures that you use to attack the enemy, the opposite player, and win the game, usually. Sometimes you use spells, but we'll get to that. So, there are multiple different types of creatures. So, just as an example, I have 3 creatures here, and you know if it's a creature if it says creature, or if it has a power and toughness right here. The one on the left is the power, the one on the right is the toughness. So creatures are, when they enter the battlefield, they have summoning sickness. And summoning sickness just means that they can't tap to use any abilities or attack on the turn they're played, unless they have an ability called haste where they can attack right away, but that's for a different video. So this creature, if I were to play this creature, it would enter the battlefield, it has summoning sickness. I can't use any of its tap abilities or attack with it on the turn it comes out. But on the second turn, I can attack with it, I can use its abilities, whatever I want to use with it. So, creatures are always listed with creature right there. Like creature, creature, creature. And there's there's hundreds of different kinds of creatures. So, like, there's dragons, there's jellyfish, and there's walls. And there's a lot more than that, but these are just some of the ones that I pulled out. And they all do different things. So, like, walls always have defender, and that's an ability I would cover later. But it basically means they can't attack and they can only block. Uh, and this one has flying, and flying is flying, obviously. And so, the different, lots of creatures are the same, but you can have like 4 of them on the field. But if you have something like this creature right here, see, it says legendary creature. And legendary creatures, you can only have one on the battlefield at a time. So if I were to play a second one of this creature, one of them would have to go to the graveyard. That or both of them would go to the graveyard. The rules changed recently, and I'm not up to date on it. But one of them or both of them would get destroyed when you play a second one. So it's good to have just like 1 or maybe 2 legendary creatures in your deck. But that's really all the difference between the legendary creatures and regular creatures are, is that you can't have more than one on the battlefield. So, like, I can't have 2, I can't have 1, and your opponent can't have 1. That's how it works. So, creatures are very basic. They're not that complicated until it comes to attacking and blocking. But that's for a different video. So, now we have artifacts, and artifacts are generally colored in this manner. This is an older card, so it's going to have a little bit of a different color scheme. But they always have like gray borders unless they are colored artifacts, but generally they have gray borders. So artifacts are usually good for some kind of utility. So this one specifically is tap 2 mana and put a multicolored creature or card from your hand to the battlefield. So I could say use this ability, tap 2 and this card, and I could play this and play this creature from my hand to the battlefield because it has 2 colors in its mana cost. And that makes it a multicolored creature. And there are single color creatures too, like this one is a single color creature because it only has blue in its mana cost. And there are lots of different combinations of single color and multicolor. So you can have really any combination. So artifacts are usually good for some kind of utility, like I said. And I told you what this one does. There are other kinds of artifacts called equipments. And equipments you attach to creatures. And those creatures, they gain some kind of bonus, or depending on if the card is meant to hinder them, they get some kind of debuff. So artifacts are kind of there. They're not always creatures, but there are artifact creatures. But they're there for utility most of the time. And then there's 2 more types of cards, and one that I don't have with me. And that one I don't have with me is called an enchantment. And enchantments do some kind of effect to the field. So there's field enchantments, which affect everything on the field. So there's an enchantment comes to mind where it gives all white creatures +1/+1. +1 to attack, +1 to defense. And it affects all white creatures. Or there's cards that say only your creatures, or there's cards that say creatures your opponents control, everything but yours. And so there's lots of different variety in the way the cards are worded. And so field enchantments usually affect the field in some way. It doesn't specifically say field enchantment, it says enchantment on it. So like right here where this one says sorcery, it would say enchantment. And there's another type of enchantment called enchantment auras. And enchantment auras are usually meant to be equipped to something. So kind of like how I talked about with equipment artifacts, you can equip enchantments to creatures. Now, with artifacts and equipments, you can change who they're equipped to. With enchantments, you can't. So I could play an enchantment onto my creature here, and it would gain some kind of bonus or some kind of debuff depending on the card. So that's kind of how that works. And there's enchantments curses. And enchantment curses were only introduced in one set, and they're only from one set. They haven't been brought back. But they are meant to be played on enemy players. So, like, instead of playing an enchantment on me or one of my creatures or on the field, it targets someone directly. So I can hinder the other person directly. So those are kind of the basic types of enchantments. There might be more that aren't coming to mind at the moment, but we'll move on. So all cards when they are entering the battlefield are considered spells. And so, like, creatures, when they're being played, they're considered spells. Same with artifacts, enchantments, planeswalkers, everything, except for lands. Lands are not considered spells. So, the only difference is that there's some spells that are always spells. So, so this card called Cultivate, it's a sorcery. And now, the card type sorcery means it can only be played during one of your main phases. So, during your turn, there's your first main phase before you attack, and your second main phase after you attack. And you could play a sorcery in both main phases, but you can't play it while you're attacking, or while you're drawing a card, or while it's during your upkeep, or anything like that. Now, on the other hand, are instants, and instants can be played all the time. It doesn't matter whose turn it is. They can be played during any phase of your turn. So I could be attacking, and I can play this card. And this card specifically counters a spell. So I can counter anybody that's trying to play a creature, like this creature. Or just planeswalker, an artifact, an enchantment, another sorcery, another instant. I can counter those spells with this one. But instants can be played at any time. And there's this metaphorical thing called the stack. And the way the stack works is if you play this card, okay, you play this sorcery, then I play this card, right, this instant, to counter your spell. Now, the way the stack works is if the cards play in reverse order than they are played in. So instead of this effect going off first, this effect would. So I would counter your spell before it has a chance to use its ability. So that's the metaphorical thing called the stack, and that's why instants are good for many different things, and they can be played at any time. There are older cards that are called interrupts. Right here, let's say interrupts. And interrupts haven't been reprinted, but they still exist if you have some older cards. And interrupts make it so that on that stack, if I were to play this Cultivate, and you played a card with an interrupt, that would make it so that no one, including me or you, can play anything on top of that card. So I play a sorcery, you play an interrupt, no one can play anything, unlike an instant where you can just counter it. And before this video gets any longer, I want to cover the last card type, and that's Planeswalkers. And Planeswalkers can be considered the best, the worst. It depends on how you see them and how you play them. So, generally with Planeswalkers, they have their mana cost, just like every card but lands. They have their names, they have their types, um, and with planeswalkers, it works in the same sense as legendary creatures, where you can't have two of the same named planeswalkers on the field. So this card's name is Sarkhan Unbroken. No one else or me can have a Sarkhan Unbroken. So the rules were recently changed to accommodate for new planeswalkers that came out. Where instead of both the planeswalkers being destroyed, they would just return to your hands. Um, and that makes it so that you can replay it later or something if theirs goes away somehow. But uh, that's kind of how planeswalkers work. Now, in general, planeswalkers have 3 to 4 abilities. They generally don't have two, or they don't have two, and they don't have 5. It's 3 or 4. There's very few planeswalkers that have 4 abilities. The general amount of them have 3 abilities. So when you play your creature, or your planeswalker, sorry, they start out with a number down here. Now, this planeswalker has a 4 down there. Wait for the camera to focus. So it has a 4. So what that is those are loyalty counters. And the loyalty counters are kind of like your health. In a sense, planeswalkers are counted as another player. So if you're playing a game with 2 people, and you play planeswalker, there's technically 3 people in the game. So this is kind of how, like, the way this works, his loyalty counters, is that's his life. And that life is manipulated in many ways. It makes it so that you can deal direct damage to it. It makes it so that you can attack the planeswalker. You have to specifically target the planeswalker, but that's for a different video. And so each planeswalker usually has 1/1 ability. And that will give its loyalty counter +1, so it'd go up to a 5 loyalty counter. So that it would have more life and you could do more things with it. And they generally have a minus ability, a smaller amount, and that does some kind of ability that works for you. And so this one, it puts out a 4/4 red dragon. And it would subtract the loyalty counters by 2. So if we're at 4, it would go down to 2 loyalty counters, and you could use it again, and it would go down, and it would be at 0, and then it would go to the graveyard. And you can't use the abilities if you don't have enough loyalty counters to use them. So that's what makes the final abilities hard to get to and hard to use. So this one is -8, so you have to use this first ability 4 times before you can use its final ability. And keeping a planeswalker alive for 4 turns can be difficult. So that's why the last abilities are usually strong. So this one, it searches for all the dragons in your library, and you can play them onto the battlefield. And that's kind of generally how lots of planeswalkers are. They have a huge effect if you can get enough loyalty counters saved up. And so that kind of goes over planeswalkers. There is more specifics with them, but that's the bare basics about planeswalkers, just going over what they are. So I hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial. I hope you learned something useful. And I hope that your Magic career starts here and it gets even better.